Well, good evening, everybody. Certainly good to be with you again. I've been with many of you kind of twice already this week. This is number 3. I think several of us will be together again tomorrow night for the highlighting party. I know Ryan was moving tables. I'm sure Josh, you had a little bit of a workout today, moving tables and playing Jenga, trying to figure out how we're going to put 30 people in the high school classroom. So great opportunity to be together, and certainly a great time to pause and reflect on God's word and spend a little bit of time contemplating the life of Daniel. So any other announcements, church family announcements, anything we need to bring before? Nick, if you start us off with a word of prayer, please.
God, you're a gracious and merciful God. Thank you so much for the opportunity we have to gather here to study your word, to learn more about you. Lord, as we study the life of Daniel, please help us to take away applications and points that we can apply to our lives as we grow our faith and grow in our steadfastness. Lord, please be with Kevin, help him to recall the things he's prepared, and help us to have a class where we can fervently learn more about you and grow closer together. In your name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. So Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to be at tonight. Daniel in the lion's den is probably a story that many of us were like, all right, I've done this all the way since I was a little toddler. But what are some of the kind of things you think of? This seems very loud. What are some of the things you think of when you think about the story of Daniel and the lion's den? What are some of the kind of high level kind of words or kind of phrases that you would think of when you think of that story?
Daniel's faith.
Faithful? Integrity is something I have on my list. It's also kind of faithful in the face of opposition. I think that's the part that I want to draw out as we think about most of the lesson tonight. I want to really kind of think about that. And I think as we start off, I want to start actually kind of looking a little bit at the timeline of where we are. Let's see if I can get it to go. Can you advance me? All right. I think my batteries might be dead here. Anyway. I'll just have you advance me. So as we look at this timeline, right? So Daniel chapter 1 is 605 BC. We're sitting here at Daniel chapter 6, and we're all the way kind of that second lightning bolt, right? At 539. So we are 66 years past when Daniel gets carried off into exile. I think in my mind, I was always thinking of Daniel just a young man, and like he's always a young man all the way through. He's like 75 years old now, plus, somewhere in that range, 75 to 80 years old. Right now, it's interesting, too. Just look at some of the things that Daniel has seen in his life. I think he gets carried away by the Babylonians. His country isn't fully kind of destroyed just yet. You see that first lightning bolt is that kind of the crushing of Nebuchadnezzar of Jerusalem. And so that was one major upheaval in his life, is just moving. The second one is then truly his homeland gets destroyed, and things of the temple are gone, and he's holding on and keeping going. Well, now there's a whole nother regime, right? I've gotten good. I'm doing well with this Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. I've risen up. And I'm kind of in a decent spot, just holding on, and then everything gets tipped upside down. And we read we finished this last Wednesday night. So Daniel chapter 5, verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom of about 62 years old. So all of a sudden, it's a whole new kingdom. The things that you knew and could figure out, right? He had navigated a lot of things in his life, his friends, and he'd come up with a lot of things. He'd come up to a high authority under this old regime, but all of a sudden everything is upside down, and he's in a new spot. I think as we think about our lives and how we might navigate change, those are some usually pretty stressful times. Think about a major shift in your life. Maybe it's a job or a move or some other kind of big event in your life. Those are things that tend to kind of rattle us and shake us. And I think what we see in the life of Daniel isn't he does not let go of what he holds true. He grips on even tighter. I think that's a great example for us as we look about his conduct, his dedication to God didn't waver even though everything around him was upside down. Cindy?
Rob mentioned faithful, and that, to me, in addition to that, he was not gonna hide that he prayed. He purposely went where the windows were open. And
Right.
he drew attention. He wasn't
Right.
gonna hide and still obey God.
Right.
He said, okay, well,
This is who I am.
yeah. So.
Go ahead and click the slide there for me, Luke. So this is a slide, I stole this chart from Mark, right? He kind of called out this kind of chiastic poetry thing. So we are kind of in the second kind of deliverance story in the book of Daniel. The first one was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and this is the second one. Next week is really kind of be, again, that kind of that kingdom review. So go ahead and we'll move on to the next one. Probably need to click 2. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom those satraps would give account, so the king might suffer no loss." So we see already in this new regime, Daniel is kind of like, some versions will say president, right? So there's like the king, and then there's 3 guys under the king. Daniel is one of those guys. And the reason why Daniel is one of what their job is so the king would, so the satraps, so the people, the governor, the regional people that are out in the land, all owe taxes back to this king. So they've got to make sure that the money is coming back to Darius and ultimately Cyrus, who is the larger king in this setting. But Daniel's in charge of making sure that they give an account so that the king would suffer no loss. So Daniel is a really high-level tax auditor in some cases. So I'm sure that also is another reason why the people are like, I don't know about this Daniel guy. All right. Verse number 3. Daniel became distinguished above all the other higher officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the entire kingdom. We see his exemplary conduct and dedication to serving, right? I think, and I think when we think about serving our boss at work or whatever we might need to serve, right? It's to the best of our ability. And we see this, Daniel has what is said here is this excellent spirit in him. So I think it's interesting to see that, like, there's something that the other people that can see in Daniel that they want him to be in a leadership role. They want him to do what they need to do. Verse number 4. Then the high officials and satraps sought to find ground for a complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. I think what I've read, some of the commentators, and there's a book here that Ryan let me borrow. One of the major things, how people in Daniel's position made a living, was just kind of skimming stuff off the top. That's how they got ahead. Favors, bribery, taking a little bit from me. But we see here, these people go, all right, we're going to go find something wrong with Daniel. They look, they try to find something, and they find nothing. They find no complaint, no error, no fault was found in him. Daniel's a real good guy. So verse number 5, these men said, "We cannot find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, and the governors, all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so it cannot be changed. This is according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, Darius signed the document and the injunction. So we see Daniel rises to power under King Darius. It leads to jealousy by those that are all around him. The other officials, they conspire to try to trap him. They can't find anything that Daniel himself is doing, so they've got to figure out something to trap Daniel. So they say, let's kind of make the king feel really, really great. Like, oh, king, you're such a great guy. For the next 30 days, you're the only one we can say good things about. You're the only ones we can praise. You're the only one who can seek petitions to, oh, king, you're the greatest. Again, remember, this is the very beginning of this new kind of kingdom, right? It's brand new. All these people are kind of vying for the great jobs. But Daniel's consistency and his blamelessness led him to being a target. It led him to be found out of step with the rest of the crowd. And they're like, well, the only thing we can figure out is if we figure out something with his God. How can that, as we look in our own lives, do we sometimes see how our own faith, our own integrity can put us out of touch, out of sync, put us at odds with the rest of the world? So how do we kind of endure? How do we maintain our integrity in the face of that kind of negative connotation that the world would have with us? Ian?
Well, sometimes people have faith. I mean, faith without works is dead, but like faith alone. You don't do. I can't just trust in God that He's going to do something for me and not have works. I have to have faith and works together.
I think you see a lot of times like I don't know if jealousy factor is the right word, but people get uncomfortable by others living a really upright life, and even sometimes eager to find something that disproves you're not really who you say you are, because then I'll feel better about my own inconsistencies. And so, ironically, the most upright people have the highest standard and are being watched with the most scrutiny, and clearly that's getting to Daniel and even foreshadows Jesus.
Right.
The only charges we can run him up on are falsely related to his devotion to God.
I guess this is maybe like the flip side of what you were saying, but I was just thinking how incredible a compliment it would be if somebody could say about me that the only way that we will find anything against her is if we set her up with God because she's not gonna go against him. I think when they make this decree, I know we're not quite to this next part, but it would have been really easy to say, like, I can still petition God in my head, and nobody will know what I'm doing, and still be true to him, but that would have been compromising what he had been doing in the past, and they were right, they could not, this was an easy way to take him down, because he was not going to waver.
I think it's something that it's interesting how much these people knew about Daniel and knew about his practices, knew about his ways. Can the same be said for us? I think I'm going to move my toes back from the hammer to drop on that. But yeah, that's a hard one to say. It's like, do my coworkers know that? Does my boss know that? Do all the people around me know where I stand and where I hope to say yes, but maybe in some cases, I think, as we kind of get into verse 10, I think sometimes on those hard conversations, it's easy to just kind of like, I'll just hang back and not really say much. let they just kind of go on about their way. I think we'll see the opposite here with Daniel. So let's go ahead and Luke hit the next one. I think we're at verse number 10. What we see is truly his faithfulness. And Cindy brought this out. Let's read verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, so he knows what they're up to. He knows what's going on. He knows what they said. He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So this isn't something new for Daniel, right? This is Daniel's pattern. Daniel continues praying 3 times a day, demonstrating his steadfast commitment. Daniel's prayer life in this case wasn't a reaction to some crisis. I think that's another one where I'm going to pull my toes back a little bit too. It's like, I think, when do I pray the most? It's like when I'm the most to pray for. And I think maybe I need to be a little bit more like Daniel, because even every day and his dedication, this 3 times per day, was part of his daily discipline, right? This is something that he did every day. I think as we've started this year kind of spend more time talking about the daily Bible reading, it's one of the aspect of it. I think this prayer piece is something that can very much complement that same daily discipline. And it underscores maybe the importance of how prayer in our lives can help guide our hearts and minds and bring us in a closer relationship with God that can hold us up when these things come up and the struggles that we might face in the world. So I think that love to kind of open up a little bit too is how do we kind of cultivate a more thorough prayer life? What are some of the things that maybe you have done in your own life or have seen others do that we can use to kind of encourage each other in how prayer can be done in our lives or how it might impact our own lives?
In this case, it's hard to imagine 119 people coming after me and knowing me that well. I don't think I could even imagine that, but I do know Satan knows me very well, and if I put it in that kind of spiritual lens, I can totally imagine him setting me up in this scenario so that I don't choose to worship or I don't choose to make God the king of my life. And that is probably an everyday occurrence. And for me to pray is, I think you have to know what you're praying for, what you're doing, and what are the things that make you want to go against God or take him off the throne of your life. And that's what makes sense to me.
Cindy?
When you read that verse 10, some of the words that pop out to me is, he continued kneeling. So it's something that was part of his life. It wasn't something I better pray to God about this moment because I might be really hurt. No, he did it all the time. And then it says, now when Daniel knew that the document, so he knew where to go for help. Even though he knew that it had been signed and he knew that he was going to probably be thrown in that den, he knew what he had to do. And I think that's something that we have to know, that God he's the one that's in charge. And if we want to, be pleasing, we better be continuing to kneel.
I think, too, as we think about our prayer life and how we formalize our prayer, I think, and many times I kind of get stuck in I don't know what to say, or I try to make it almost too formalized. And I think that there's a place and time for that, and especially our public prayers, there's absolutely a place and a time for that. But I think in our own personal prayers, we just kind of have to pour out our hearts a little bit and kind of, it's just an open book. God already knows our hearts, but I think that the going through, whether you're physically saying the words or you are mentally saying those words in your mind, how much more powerful those things in our petitions and our graciousness and our thanksgiving, that we can outpour our hearts and our minds and pray for the things that we don't know what to do, and asking for guidance. I think those are all things that super powerful in our own lives. And it's not something we can just, I think your point is like Daniel was doing this every day. It wasn't just its reaction to a crisis. I think that's easy, kind of like, I'll turn the sirens on, time to pray because we got a major issue. No, Daniel was doing this all along the way, and I think that's a great example for us and how we might better our own relationship with God in prayer.
Yeah, I think about if my kids, just a parent-child relationship, if Morgan, Emma, Jake, Katie, and, you know, all my bonus kids, if we only talked high level, you know, big stuff, I got a job, we had a baby, we're moving, if the daily relationship isn't there and that bridge isn't built, it's a lot harder to go across when you have those big things going on in your life. So it's the little things, and I think, I know for sure, for me, when big things have come along, they've gone a lot better if I've been in communion with God about the daily things, you know, the things that I think like, I don't know if he want to hear this, and then I think, of course he wants to hear this.
Yeah.
He's my father. I want to hear everything from all of these kids that I love. Like, you couldn't call me enough, because I love them, and he loves me that much more.
Sure. It's funny. I mean, you don't realize how maybe that goes. But it's funny, driving back home from Tampa with Caroline, like we talked the whole way for 16, 17 hours about stuff, meaningful stuff and very trivial stuff. But I think that, again, yeah, that conversation and that depth of relationship is absolutely, the parent-child is a great metaphor. Any other thoughts or comments on prayer?
Also, I just think like he knew that he didn't have anything to fear. As we read through the book of Daniel, we've already seen God deliver his people again and again. We've seen him reveal prophetic messages that Daniel had a part in, like speaking about. He knows who his God is and that he is the author of all of history. And I think that knowing him so well probably feeds into his desire to talk to him 3 times a day, and it just like builds on each other.
Yeah, I think too, it's like, yeah, again, he's 75, 80 years old too. It's like, he's not new at this, but it's interesting. I think, I wonder how much of a challenge though would have been, because it's like, I had these other guys all figured out and they were leaving me alone. Everything was kind of good. And then these new guys are not. He didn't stop. He just kept going. Let's move on, picking up there in verse number 11. These men came by agreement and found Daniel petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said, King, concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any other god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast in a den of lions? So you got these people, they're buttering up the king. Oh, king, don't you remember this great decree? And we're only going to talk to you and only petition to you. And there's a huge penalty. Yeah, these guys are pretty good. The king answered and said, this stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. So it's something that's interesting in the annals of this kind of Medes and Persians. So this realm essentially is coming from east of Babylon. They're typically, they kind of started mostly in Susa, which is kind of like Iran a little bit, kind of further to the east. This is kind of something that in their world as a way to kind of like make sure things stick. They've kind of got this, like, if it's written down and the king signs it, that's it. There's no undo button. There's no veto power. It's something, I think, as reading in some commentaries, it's something that maybe could technically be done, but there's so much of a loss of face and a loss of kind of this power trip that they're like, well, I've said it, so I'm always right, so whatever I say is right. And we'll see that Darius is kind of regretting some of this in just a couple of verses here. But this whole Medes and Persians cannot be revoked is something you also see in the book of Esther. Verse 13, then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, and can you imagine Darius's countenance kind of when they said Daniel? He's like, oh no. Who is one of the exiles? Remember, Daniel's been in exile for 66 years. This is not something that's new, but it is something they're casting some shadow and shade on Daniel. He's one of these, he's not one of us. He's one of these exile people. Remember him? He's from Judah. He pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed to make his petition 3 times a day. And then we see Darius' reaction there in verse 14. Then the king, when he had heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded that Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid at the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and the signet of the Lord's, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So we see here, Daniel is arrested. He's thrown into the lion's den. But it's interesting to see how distressed Darius is. Daniel had an impact on Darius as a person, not just as a servant or a king to like subject kind of relationship. I feel like Darius really is emotional in this because he's distressed. He's not doing well. He tries everything he can to undo this thing, and is not able to do it. It's interesting, too, his comment to Daniel, may your Lord, your God whom you serve, deliver you. Daniel had an influence on Darius quite a bit, if he knew that much. Again, it's how might we have an influence on those around about us? To know that they understand our faith in God, and it may have an impact even on them. Picking up then in verse number 19. Then at the break of the day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And they came near to the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to his king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. And the king was exceedingly glad and commanded Daniel to be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones into pieces. So we see here the miracle of Daniel's kind of saving. It's a powerful testimony, not only to God's power, but also to Darius, and kind of how might God and his sovereignty over these lions and his ability to send an angel there to hold back their mouths, to stop their mouths. It vindicates Daniel, and it also glorifies God. So, we see how God's power and faithfulness to his servants is shown here. I think that's something in our own lives we see not only in, first of all, in our own salvation, right? This is the picture of our own salvation, and our putting our trust in God to save us from eternal damnation, and allows us to be saved through him. I think there are many other times in our lives where by us following God, we are saved, maybe not from physical harm like Daniel was, but we are saved through him. I think this is also a time where we can think about just the protection that God puts around each one of us. I think that's something that's kind of to be mindful of and be thinking of, is like, how might we glorify God in all of our activities and all of our things that we might do.
I don't know if you were to point out at the end where it talks about, how he makes a different decree based on this. And I think of how Nebuchadnezzar did something similar. When Daniel's three friends were in the fiery furnace. And I think of God, the way he works in different ways. So they had these laws that couldn't change. Well, they could write another law,
Yeah.
sort of cancel out the law. Esther, you think of her situation, the Jews were all to be exterminated. Oh wait, but they can defend themselves. So God works in these other ways, even in the laws that are supposedly ironclad and can't be changed. He'll still work through whatever loopholes they have in their own laws.
I think we see too in Darius is kind of how he's explaining, right? He says, Daniel, servant of the living God, right? That recognition too, I think, of the distinction between maybe what they would hold as gods versus Daniel's God is actually doing something. Any other thoughts on this part? It is interesting, yeah, everybody that kind of went against Daniel got their kind of reward at the end. And, oh, by the way, let's go and take your family and your kids with you. They've
Really magnifies for me the consequence of those malicious men, of the leaders of their households, and what they were, or where, I should word it this way, where their allegiance lied. They were in it to make themselves better by kind of doing what Cain did was, well, if you take out the one that's doing the right thing, then you're seen in a better light, instead of just wishing and working to make yourself better. They tried to snuff out a servant of God who had his allegiance in God fully. And God made it so that he would come out triumphant and that they would be destroyed. That's really interesting.
All right, we're going to finish up here with the last few verses of this chapter and then talk about a little bit more application in our own lives. So verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. So it's interesting, I think, as these Achaemenid kings, which is kind of what this land is kind of called out to be. They didn't just see them kings over what they were actually controlling. They're like, we're so great. We control the whole world, whether they really did it the whole world or not. But they saw themselves as being all-powerful kings, all-powerful world domination kings. So it's interesting, as he says, like, all right, I make a decree, all these people, all the nations that dwell in all the earth are going to need to listen to this. Peace be multiplied to you. I will make a decree that in my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is a living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It's interesting. This decree, you would think this is coming from a prophet or a priest or somebody. This is coming from a pagan king. Daniel's influence on this is to the point where this pagan king is making this decree to everybody that he has power over. Hey, listen up. I've just witnessed something that should not have happened. We threw a man into a place where a bunch of lions were. He should have not come out the next day. I walked up there and expecting to find nothing left of Daniel, and I walk up and I say, hey, Daniel, are you there? And he's like, hey, king, how you doing? He's like, this God is great. He's a living God, enduring forever. It's interesting, too. Think about the Daniel chapter 2 and the kingdom, the rock, right, that smashes the statue. And what did he say here? This kingdom, his kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall never end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He saved Daniel from the lions. He emphasizes this God who Daniel is serving is greater than what he is aware of. I think that's the part that got me is this pagan king is like, you gotta watch and listen for this God that Daniel serves. And all of this is coming from Daniel's faithfulness. Daniel standing up to his peer group, challenging his faithfulness, putting obstacles in his way. Daniel stood up to that, endured that persecution, and ultimately we see then the influence that Daniel wielded there. Daniel 6 is a profound lesson in faithfulness, integrity, but I think the flip side is it's a profound lesson in God's deliverance and God's power and God's authority. It's much higher than what this assembled 120 satraps and this king who felt like he was ruling the world, and he signed it and put his ring on it in a way that can't be undone. God's power is greater than that, and Daniel knew that. It's interesting how Daniel's character and his own kind of endurance, I think that's the part that is interesting to me as we think about that timeline we looked at the very beginning. How often would we endure that long in a place where so many challenges? I think that's a great lesson for us is hold on. We're in a world with many, many challenges. Sometimes they're very personal attacks towards us. Sometimes they're just, the world feels like it's squishing us from everything. But ultimately, we can be encouraged to remain steadfast, right? Trust in God's sovereign power. Look past what the people on earth can do and look to what ultimately God can do, right? His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion will go on until the end. It's interesting, I often wonder, and we have just a few minutes left, but we see Daniel prospers, and we see Daniel being in a position of power. We saw Joseph in a position of power in Egypt, how these men use their influence to influence those very powerful people around them. It's interesting how God has chosen to use people like Daniel and have these people. I think we don't always understand why and how their influence nets out. But as we see Cyrus come on the stage here, Cyrus has a huge positive feeling towards the Jews. And as they start to go back to the land, he gives them resources and allows them to go back and to rebuild the temple and have the walls. I wonder how much of Daniel's efforts here really helped pave the way and kind of gain that kind of understanding for Cyrus is like, oh, these people are the real deal, and maybe I should let them go back. I don't think we have full understanding of that, but I think it's certainly, Daniel was in the right place at the right time to help influence some things for good. So what can we do, whether it's small or big, in our own lives that we can maybe see where we can maybe influence somebody that may have the power to do something differently? How can we encourage someone that we have maybe no thought or promise of that they will follow God, but maybe by us saying the right thing at the right time gets them thinking, plants that seed, figure out how we can wield our own influence. And maybe it's something simple like a dinner or a kind word when somebody's feeling down, or just helping somebody in their time of need. Some of those things that are very small, and also kind of, I think, as we look at ourselves, are we shirking back from who we are when we're out with other people? Are we shirking back from who we are as Christians? Do we take the time to pray for our meals when we're out with a big crowd of people that aren't our family or friends or church? Do we do that? Do we say, hey, let's just say a prayer for our food before we eat? Those are some small things that we can do. I think that do people understand why Wednesday night attendance is important and why we say, I can't come to that because I already have an obligation to go to worship on Wednesday or Sunday morning or whatever it might be. I think we can be inspired by this example in Daniel to remain steadfast, to always kind of put ourselves, who we are, out there a little bit and really kind of show the world who God is in our own lives. We have about 4 minutes left, 3 minutes left. Any other thoughts before we finish up this morning or this evening? Regan?
I was kind of thinking along the lines of putting ourselves in Darius's position, because there's been times that we have our friends in Daniel's position where only God can help them out of this rut. And we can, when our friends open up to us, they're like, hey, I have this problem, or they come to the front of the church and ask for the church's help. How are we responding to that? Because Darius didn't even believe in God, and he said, God be with you, and I'm going to fast, I will not sleep, and as soon as you get out of this rut, I'm going to come up and say, did God protect me enough? And if we start telling other people and praying, fasting for other people, how much more will our faith grow in return to see God's grace?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think this example of Darius, I think even Nebuchadnezzar, it's like, I some kind of feel like, where were they in their belief? I think sometimes we see really good, and then sometimes it's like then the next minute they're falling apart, but absolutely. Any other thoughts here as we close out tonight? Cindy?
In verse 27, he delivers and rescues. I just have a note here that we can look forward to that because he is delivering us, he's rescuing us from eternal death. So he's not done. He's still to be glorified when that happens.
Thank you. Lisa? Absolutely. All right. Anybody else? Thanks, everybody.